Hello and welcome back to Deep Sleep Creep's YouTube channel. Today we're going to be listening to a compilation of January 2024 horror stories. This is to help those catch up on some stories they may have missed this month. Now relax, get comfy, and let's go deep. Back in 2019, I was leaving from a buddy's house to head home. He lived on a lake in a county well known for its high crime rate. I was a good 20 miles away, so I decided to take the back roads to save time and avoid traffic. As I turned onto this mountain road, I saw a van off the side of the road. The doors are all open and the lights are on. It's well after midnight, which makes this encounter that much more strange. I slowed my manual car down to first gear, looking for a person or persons that may be hurt. Not a soul is around and the woods are quiet. I remember thinking, shit, I don't have cell service until... So I proceeded to go towards where I knew I would have cell service. Maybe going 20 miles per hour tops. I knew this situation was suspicious, but I also knew I wouldn't forgive myself if someone was in dire need of help. Unfortunately, it gets worse. No more than 3 or so miles away, the brush thinned on the roadside, so you had a better view of what's in the woods. I see movement, so I let off the gas, thinking I don't want to run over a deer and have it ruin my car. When, as I let off, a man, soaking in fresh blood, comes from the tree line and into the road. He's so covered in gore I couldn't tell it was a man at first. Needless to say, I was stunned, grossed out and in utter disbelief all at once. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This couldn't be real, I thought. I blinked so many times thinking he would just go away, but he was still there. He stumbled out in front of the car and waved me down. I was in my ragtop, top down of course. He was yelling and grabbing at my door. I dropped into first gear and took off. Another mile or so I had cell service and called the cops. Guy was obviously hurt and his grab for my door scared me. There was a wide space on the mountain where I agreed to wait for the cops. They were there in under 10 minutes. While I waited, I put the top up, then locked the doors. An officer took my statement and he looked over my car with his flashlight. The guy from the woods left a bloody smear down my door. Another officer found the van, but couldn't locate the guy who came out of the woods. The cops let me go home and said they'd call if they needed anything further. I knew cops would say that and never call, so I really wasn't expecting a call. But to my surprise, within a few days I did get a call, saying the van was located, and they asked if I could describe the man. I described the man and helped out any way I could, but sadly, they never found him that night. And as far as I know, they never did. Apparently the van was stolen, and the cops concluded this guy banged himself up and took off in a panic. As far as I know, they never did track him down. To this day, I keep a lookout for a bloody man running out of the woods. This experience has stuck with me and not surprisingly caused me to have a little PTSD from it. I don't know if anyone will believe me or not, but this weird encounter has been on my mind ever since it happened. I'm a respiratory therapist that works at a local hospital. I was on my way to work, about less than a mile away from my occupation, when the car in front of me quickly merged into one of the emergency lanes as if something sudden had just happened. Then he just sat there. No hazards going off, nothing to indicate he planned on moving. I still had 20 minutes before I had to be at work. Assuming this individual may be in distress or have car problems, I decided to be a good Samaritan and help him. A decision which I'll later regret. I parked on the shoulder off of the road and turned on my hazards. We exchanged eye contact and I gestured a wave, rolled down my window and asked, "Are you okay?" He seemed to have either not heard me or ignored me entirely, but he did seem to realize I wanted to help him. He gets out of his car at this point. Keep in mind we are on an extremely busy highway. I'm in my work scrubs, which tends to help people relax knowing they are with a healthcare professional. However, this was different. When he got out of his vehicle, I assumed he would have told me he was in some type of pain or something that caused him to pull over abruptly, since he was driving just fine the entire time I was behind him. So I casually got out of my vehicle and walked over to the back end of his car. This is when I officially start a conversation asking if he's hurt. Is something wrong? All the basics. But the thing is, his eyes were cold. He had this body language to him that almost made him seem a little unhinged or skittish. He had not answered any of my questions, so I tried once more asking, "Hey man, we're in the middle of a busy road. Is there something wrong with your car or something going on with you?" He simply replied, "No." I started to feel this sensation of discomfort, like he wanted to do something to me but was restraining himself. So I continued to play it off. He didn't seem drunk or high, but he had these black beady eyes that I couldn't stop looking at. His bald head also made those eyes look more pronounced. It was as if he was just a vessel to something evil. I tried to continue the conversation. "Why did you stop, man? You don't want to get hit out here." He replies, "I don't know. I don't know where to go." I didn't know what he meant by this, so I questioned him further by saying, "Do you know what city you're in right now? If you're lost, I can tell you where the nearest highway is." His reply was a little chilling as he more so whispered, "No, not here, not now." I was now confused. He didn't know where he was but felt this urge to get out of the area as quickly as possible. So I asked, "Well, what direction are you wanting to go? That way will take you north and the other way will take you south to Cincinnati." I explained to him. He asks, "What would you do in my position?" Now I have no idea what he meant by this. I simply said, "I don't know what kind of position you're in, man. Can you drive? The hospital I work for is within view and we don't have to go in. I just want to make sure you don't get hit." He agreed to follow me, but once I turned on my blinker to turn into the hospital, he completely stopped following me, pulled a U-turn and sped off. I know this isn't the creepiest thing in the world, but you really have to try to understand just how foreign and strange this behavior was. Each time we engaged in conversation, it was as if he was contemplating to tell me something but ultimately remained silent. From the looks of it, he drove a nice black Toyota. So I mean, he didn't have a broken down car or looked like he was a substance abuser. He just seemed incredibly nervous, and his fast motion gestures and twitches of all his body language has left me puzzled and still gives me shudders when I think about how he moved, talked, lack of response, declining any help, and not explaining a single reason as to why he just decided to park on the side of the road. A simple, "Oh, I'm just lost," would even be enough for me to feel better about the entire situation. He just seemed incredibly paranoid and hesitant. On top of that, the entire conversation led nowhere to his situation, or why he was acting so strange. I just wanted to make sure he didn't need help or get hit by a car. Anyway, I'll update you guys if I hear anything about a patient coming in later. He also has a face that is burned into my memory. I just got this gut feeling to leave but be as polite as possible. Anyone have any thoughts on this? I'll try my best to recall this story that just popped into my memory randomly. This would have been in the late 90s in Connecticut, maybe about 1998. I was a teenager, and some of my friends had started getting their driver's licenses, so we did what any teen in the 90s did, and drove around with our friends looking for something to do in a small town. There were about 5 of us in a friend's car. I wasn't driving, I was on the passenger side in the back seat. We were riding around, listening to music, talking. No substances like drugs or alcohol were being used. We were on a dirt, windy road at night when suddenly the driver slammed on her brakes, and we watched as this creature crossed in front of us. Illuminated by the headlights, the creature was about toddler height, very, very pale, no clothing, bald, very slender. It paused briefly to look at us. I remember we all got dead silent. It passed the road so quickly and went into the woods. It walked on 2 legs. It was most certainly not an animal I'd ever seen, especially since it was bipedal. And it definitely wasn't a little kid. The only thing I can't recall is its face. I did see the creature, but from my seat in the car, my view was slightly obstructed. We were all silent for a few moments, processing what we'd seen. I remember another passenger whispered, "Dude, what the F was that?" We continued on in silence with the occasional, "Did you effing see that thing?" We kept the radio off at that point, and the driver started bringing us all to our homes. We were so creeped out we didn't feel like having fun anymore. We would occasionally bring it up, but overall never spoke a word about it after that. I've lost touch with all of them at this point. I'm in my 40s now, but we never did find out what we saw. This was before most of us had even home computers, let alone a cell phone or Google. Any ideas? I don't even know where to begin, but I'm going to try to make this as organised as possible. This started last January, right after the New Year. I was walking home from school with a couple of friends, and we stopped at the library to get some more of our volunteer hours in. Maybe a half an hour after we got there, a man who looked to be maybe late 20s to early 30s had came up to the table we were sitting at and organising books, and asked if he could sit with us. We got weirded out and said no because he gave off an odd vibe, and he was an evidently grown man, so that was a little off-putting. We ended up just signing out and leaving shortly after that, because he just kept staring. We walked a few blocks and he didn't follow us or anything, so we knew it was safe to go home. That was the first incident. Nothing more happened that day. Until maybe a few weeks later, I was at home and the doorbell rings. My mum tells me to go get the door, so I do. And it's the same man that was at the library a few weeks ago. He had an Amazon package in his hand and said he was told to deliver it to me by hand, even though it was nothing important. And usually things just get dropped off at the door. Not to mention he was just wearing casual clothes, not like delivery driver attire or anything. So I thanked him and started to shut the door. But before I could fully shut the door, he told me to wait and said something along the lines of, "Nice seeing you again." Then he started asking me all these questions like how old I am, if I live here, who I live with, what school I go to, etc. I thanked him and ended up just closing the door on him and locking it. I told my mum and she wasn't too concerned, as she said he was probably just being friendly, but she said for me not to answer the door for packages anymore, and she would keep an eye on the cameras. That was it for a few days. Another incident occurred where maybe 5 days later, I was working at a restaurant and he comes in. And just my luck, guess who has to be his waitress? Me. I freaked out, but obviously, this is my place of work, so I had to somewhat keep my composure. I greeted him, and he starts making uncomfortable small talk again. I told him I'm on a tight schedule and asked for his order, and he ordered. Then I told him it would be out in a minute. I ended up going to the back, telling my manager the situation, and then she ended up going out there and giving him his food. I hid in the back for the remaining time until she said he was gone. She said he asked about me. I made sure she didn't tell him anything, and luckily she didn't. Then that same night, I was on my way to my car and someone honks. I look over and it's him waving me over to his car. When I tell you I jumped into my car so fast, that's not an understatement. I was too scared to drive home, so I drove around for a bit and did the 4 right turn trick until I felt safe enough to go home. Looking back on it, I know this sounds silly since he already knew where I lived, but when you're in such a scared state of mind, you don't think right. I went and told my mum, and she finally said this was enough and we can go to the police. They really didn't end up doing much of anything besides make a report of it, and said to keep an eye on it and keep them updated if any more issues come up. Because this could all just be friendly coincidences, and he hasn't done anything physical. Sadly, I ended up seeing his car a few more times at places I've been, but that could be a coincidence, so that didn't concern me that much. Until about maybe around 3 weeks ago, I was just getting done with dance and walking out of my studio when I noticed his car was parked directly in front of it. I panicked and I went back into my studio. Considering I was just right outside, I quickly locked the door on my way in. I told my dance teacher about it, and she gave me a ride home that night. We went to the police and they documented it again and told me to call them next time if he returns. Finally, about 2 days after the dance incident, I ran into him again in the Target parking lot. He just happened to be there at the same time. I got in my car before we could even really make eye contact. But this time, instead of driving home, I drove to my boyfriend's who knew about the situation, and I stayed at his house for most of that night. Then he drove me home, because I was too scared to drive home alone that late at night. I told my mum, and she said that we really couldn't do anything about it since I was at Target, and it was a public area that a lot of people go to, so he could easily argue he was getting groceries and ran into you. She said to try to ignore it and bought me some pepper spray. Luckily, I really haven't seen him face to face since then. I've seen his car around, but I hoped he finally got bored of following me around. That was my creepy stalker experience that I'm still to this day having issues with. I hope it'll be over soon. This all happened about 5 years ago. Please forgive me if some details are left out, as it has been a long time. For starters, I grew up in southwest Canada where it was all farmland for miles and miles. I moved on to my cousin's and her boyfriend's farm in 2019 to live in the other house that is on their property. The house is fairly old, but I loved it. It wasn't long after I moved in, though, that I started to feel uneasy in the house alone. I would close every window when it got dark, as it felt like something was watching me through them every night. Eventually, I decided to get a puppy to keep myself company when my boyfriend at the time was at work or away from the house. It helped to have the company, but I always dreaded having to take her outside when it was dark. For some context, our house sat on the left side of the gravel road. At the back of the house there was about 10 meters of what you might call a backyard, and then there was the cow pasture and the cow barn. We didn't own cows, but in the summer another farmer would rent our space, and so we would have them on the property. It wasn't uncommon at night to hear coyotes surrounding the farm either, and there were tons. Every so often when I'd go out with my puppy, we'd hear them all around us, too close for comfort. We had a farm dog too, who would keep the coyotes away for the most part, as she was huge, but every so often she'd wander elsewhere on the property to scout, and the coyotes would get a little too close for comfort. They always tried to lure my puppy out to them, but luckily I kept her leashed. Now, one thing you should know about my pup is that it takes her forever to find a spot to go potty. She would pace for at least 10 minutes, and that was only after finding a suitable spot. Sometimes we would be out there for damn near a half hour, just so she would go and not go in the house. Another problem of hers. On this particular night, it was raining pretty heavily. I was not happy to be out there, and she had decided that she wasn't going to go until she found her perfect spot. We'd already been out for 15 minutes, and at this point she was also getting frustrated with the rain and wanted to go inside, but I wanted her to go before we went in, since we'd already been out there for so long. So, as any annoyed puppy mother would do, I started getting a little frustrated and would repeat "go, go potty" every time she'd get distracted from her objective. It was dark, I was cold and annoyed, and to make matters worse, the cows behind us were fussing fairly loudly. This was out of the ordinary for them, as they were usually quiet and sleeping at this time of night. I was also hearing what sounded like a strange bird whistling, but shook it off as probably being an owl. I tried to keep it off my mind as I kept shouting and pleading "go" through the rain to my puppy. I was facing away from the barn, and suddenly in my left ear I heard it. Go. Now, one thing you should know about me is I have a very strong flight response, but this froze me on the spot, as I was mostly confused at what I'd just heard. I tried telling myself I didn't hear it. I tried telling myself that it was just a moo from a cow that I heard wrong. But again, as if spoken directly behind me, I heard it again. Go, go. It sounded unnatural. It was as if it came from someone who had never spoken a word before. A raspy, deep monotone, go. It almost sounded like it was coming out of an old radio, but of course there were no radios out there. Every time it said it, it sounded the exact same as the first time it was said. And whatever it was had started repeating it as if it had been taught this new word. At this point I spun around to the barn and found nothing there. Then again from behind me, go! This had all happened in the span of about 3 seconds, and at this point I remember shouting out loud, "All right, we'll go!" as I picked up my little fur ball and made a mad dash for my front door. I swiftly locked both doors behind me and sat bewildered in my kitchen. My puppy went back to playing immediately, obviously unbothered by it all, and the happy mum wasn't making her stay out in the rain any longer. I picked up my phone and called my cousin, asking her if her boyfriend had been out in the field with the cows. He usually comes out to maintain the farm, but usually not at night. She said no, and that he's playing games with his buddies online. Apparently she can see his Discord status as active, indicating that he was online playing games. And I explained to her what had just happened to me. She sent her boyfriend over to the barn to check it out, but soon after told me he hadn't seen or heard anything. He said he'd check the barn again in the morning. I spent my night hiding from the windows, with the lights and TV on loud enough to not hear anything outside. The next morning, when my cousin's boyfriend checked on the barn, he found 2 cows dead. He explains that the colossal cow panic that had ensued the night before. I regret this, but I didn't push for more information as I honestly just didn't want to know. But they told me other than that, they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. A few months later, I moved off the farm. I couldn't be in that house alone anymore, and my boyfriend and I had parted ways. A few months after that, I started going to therapy for the paranoia this had caused me. I started feeling like people were watching me and were out to get me. Another few months after that, I moved out of the province for good and I finally felt safe. I'm wondering if any of you here have any idea what the hell this would have been. There's no chance there would have been someone in our field as we were fairly far away from town and neighbours, and we have cameras that would have seen anyone enter our property. Coyotes are common, but I don't think they are capable of mimicking words. Any ideas? I don't know if I overreacted calling the police. I got home from work around 11 p.m. the other night. I went to go do my pretty typical after-work routine, check the mail, walk my dog, and eat some dinner. I went to go check the mailbox when I spotted a car sitting idle in my neighbour's parking lot. I've never seen this car here before. Headlights were on, and a guy was sitting in the driver's seat. I live alone, and my boyfriend was over to drop me off at home after work. I went to unlock my apartment door for him because he wanted to pet my cat while I was out walking my dog. I took my dog to her usual potty spot, which is a pretty sketchy area with minimal lighting, of course, right? And that's when the guy who was in the pickup truck got out and started to approach me in the dark. He pulled out his phone and asked me if I had seen the lady on his screen. He showed me a picture of a lady who I could barely make out as she took up maybe 1/6 of his phone screen. He kept getting closer and closer, as I kept telling him no, I don't know who that is. He insisted that she lived in this apartment complex in Unit 30. My apartment is nowhere near Unit 30, and it's on the other side of the complex. I kept backing away from him, and my dog could sense that there was something wrong with him and started to bark at him. She rarely barks until it's absolutely necessary. The more this guy talked, the more he creeped me out. He said he needed to know her location to make sure she's not a catfish and he's not a bad guy, because his kid is in the car waiting for him, which I thought was a weird thing to say. At this point, I knew I had to get out of this situation, so I practically sprinted inside and went to go tell my boyfriend what had happened. I asked him to come out of the apartment with me to see if the car was still there, and it was. The guy had gotten back into his truck, but it was still parked in my neighbour's spot. While this was happening, my neighbour had returned home and asked the truck to move out of his parking spot, which he did, only to circle back 5 minutes later and park in the spot right next to my neighbour's car. This spooked the hell out of me, and I ended up dialing the local non-emergency line for some peace of mind. The cops came and I pointed to them the car. As they approached the car, he sped off. They decided not to follow him since he technically wasn't breaking any laws, but to call them again in case he does come back. If he does, they'll chase him down next time. Which annoyed me, but there was nothing I could do about it. My apartment has an extensive amount of security cameras due to the high crime rate in the area. I'm wondering if I should report this incident to the apartment complex and if I was justified in calling the police. Either way, it spooked me out that much where I felt I had to. This started about 6 months ago when I was getting ready for bed in my room. It was maybe 10:30 p.m. My curtains were closed so I couldn't see out the window, but I heard 3 hard knocks on the glass of my window. Of course, that scared the living shit out of me, so I didn't even look and ran and got my dad and made him look. Now I live with my parents and 2 brothers in a fairly busy neighbourhood, so noises weren't uncommon to hear, but this knock was directly on my window, so someone wanted me to hear it. The thing was, my bedroom isn't facing the front of the house or the road or anything. My room is actually towards the back of the house, so someone would have had to walk all the way around our big house and into the backyard in order to knock on my window, which seemed very odd. I had my dad check, but when he opened the curtains, no one was outside the window. He even went in the backyard to check and no one was there. That was the first incident. I closed my curtains and brushed it off as me hearing things, or some sort of animal. The following night, at almost the exact same time, I heard another 3 knocks on my window. Immediately I went and got my dad again, for him to just see nothing all over again. But this time I didn't brush it off and slept in my parents' room on the floor. The next few nights there was nothing until about a week later. I was home alone and it was about 8:30 to 9 p.m. and I was on FaceTime with my friend when I heard another 3 knocks on my window. This time I was home alone, so I couldn't go get my dad, but I ran into their room and called them. They told me to call the neighbours to check because they were out of town, so I did. The neighbours saw nothing. The night after that, it was about 1 a.m. I think, and I heard the knocking again. It wasn't 3 times though, it was more. It woke me up out of a dead sleep. I was tempted to just look out the window to see who, but part of me didn't want to know. I went and got my parents, who didn't bother to check at that point because they didn't see anything the last few times. I kept hearing the knocking for the next few nights straight, to the point where I ended up just sleeping on the couch. My parents decided to just let me switch bedrooms, and so they moved my bedroom into what was my older brother's room, who was living in the dorms at the time. He was concerned when we explained the situation and he said it was okay. After that we were hoping not to hear any more noises. After moving the bedrooms I didn't hear anything. It was good for maybe 3 nights. Then I heard it again. The same knocking, 3 hard times. This chilled me to the bone. How could they know that I switched rooms when they weren't even there when I checked? This time I was done playing around and mustered all the courage I had to look out the window. When I looked out the window, I saw what I assumed was a man, or a very big-built woman crouching down, wearing a grey hoodie and some dark jeans. I can't recall the colour. It was dark, maybe grey or black. I closed the curtains and got my parents to tell them all about it, and they informed the police. The police really couldn't do anything because we had no solid proof besides my word. They advised we get a camera facing my bedroom and around that area of the house, so that's what we did. Thankfully I haven't heard the knocking since, but I do wonder who it was. Nonetheless, hopefully the security camera can find something. A couple years ago I had a terrifying night which I can say to this day is the most chilling experience of my life. I was 15 years old, living in a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other. It was a peaceful place, or so I thought until that unforgettable night. We were home alone because my parents were away for the weekend, leaving me in the care of my older sister, Sophie. She was 16 and loved the idea of being in charge. That night we decided to watch a horror movie. Halfway through, there was a knock at the door. We jumped out of our seats, hearts pounding as we decided what to do. Sophie paused the movie and tried shaking it off. We thought it was just a neighbour or a friend. But when she opened the door, there was no one there. We laughed it off, thinking it was the horror movie that got to us. We shook it off and went back to watching our movie. We weren't bothered because we thought it was just some of the other kids playing pranks or the snowstorm. Later that night I woke up to a weird tapping sound on my window. I was a bit scared because of the dark, but I mustered the courage to peek through the blinds. There, in the dim moonlight, I saw someone or something in all black standing in our backyard, just staring at the house. I was able to notice him because the moon reflected off of the snow and exposed the figure. My heart raced. I ran to Sophie's room and woke her up. When we both looked again, the figure was gone. The next day we called and told our parents about the incident, but they said it was probably just a lost traveller or a neighbour's guest, and to not get too worked up about it. but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The following night, the tapping returned, more persistent this time. It sounded like someone was intentionally trying to scare us. I told Sophie and she called our parents, but there was no answer. We were alone and scared. Sophie decided to call the police, but as soon as she picked up the phone, the tapping stopped. We felt relieved but still on edge. We waited in silence with both our hearts pounding, unable to breathe. We stayed hyper-focused, like this for what seemed like hours on paying attention to the silence before we went back to bed. We tried to sleep, but just as I was about to drift off to sleep, we heard a sudden loud bang from downstairs that jolted us both awake. Sophie grabbed a flashlight and we tiptoed downstairs. The living room was a mess. Books from the shelves were thrown onto the floor and the couch cushions were scattered. Then we heard a whisper, a faint, eerie voice coming from the kitchen. It was singing a slow, haunting tune. Sophie gestured for us to sneak back upstairs, but as we turned, the kitchen light flicked on by itself. We bolted upstairs, locked ourselves in my room and pushed my dresser against the door. We huddled together, listening as footsteps started coming up the stairs, slow and heavy. I was even considering jumping out of the 2-story window. But what would be the point if I broke my ankle? The footsteps proceed to go up the stairs until they reached the outside of my bedroom door. They stopped right outside my room. The doorknob rattled gently, then more violently. We were trembling, holding each other tightly. The house went silent for a moment, then a voice, soft and raspy, spoke from the other side of the door. "I know you're in there, kids." We didn't respond. I had so much mixed emotions, from nausea to anger to scared to wanting to shit myself. Then the sound of footsteps left. We stayed awake the whole night. We were so scared to breathe. Sophie and I agreed to not leave until the next morning, in case the intruder pretended to walk away to get us to come out. In the morning, our parents came back and found us asleep in my room, the dresser still blocking the door. We explained everything and they called the police. The officers found no signs of forced entry, but they did find footprints outside, beneath my window and around the house in the snow. After that incident, my parents installed security cameras and an alarm system. The police patrols in our area increased, but the scariest part was that they never caught the person who stalked and terrified us that night. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear a faint tapping and I freeze, wondering if it's just my imagination or if my stalker has returned. To this day, I still can't tell what that was. If there were no signs of forced entry, could it be a ghost or a flesh and blood human being good at breaking in? I just don't understand. I know what we heard. Although if it was a ghost, he would have went through the walls and into our room, right? I still don't know. Like I said, I still wonder if the tapping noises I still hear are from my intruder or imagination. Please let me know what you think, or if you experienced a similar situation. This story takes place around mid-2016, right in the heat of the whole killer clown trend. I'm not sure if trend is the right word here, and if I offend someone by saying that I apologize in advance. A lot of people have stories from this time, and mine isn't as scary as others I have read, but I felt like sharing nonetheless because it still freaks me out to this day. This was around fall break of 2016. My cousin and I were both in middle school, me in 7th, him in 6th, and I was staying over at his house one night during the break. There were quite a few people in the house that night. Me, my cousin, his 9-year-old brother, his 2-year-old sister, 3-month-old baby brother, his dad, and his stepmom. Let me try and explain the layout of the house and yard where my cousins and uncle lived. They lived in a rather large double-wide trailer that they bought and had out on a flattened part of a hill. Their driveway is a rather steep gravel slope that connected to the road at the bottom of the hill. Behind the house up the hill was nothing but woods. The nearest house was just slightly down the hill to the left, closer to the road. That was our grandparents' house. With the layout set up, let me continue to the story. As I said, my cousin and I were the only ones still awake. The rest of the family were fast asleep. We were watching TV, probably some shitty sitcom on Nick at Night or something. We kept hearing noises in the woods behind the house. We could see into the woods from the window in the living room where we were sitting, but we didn't pay much attention to it since it was kind of windy. Plus, my uncle had lots of motion lights around the outside of the house. In the back, facing the woods, the side door, close to the driveway on the opposite side of the house, and on the slightly elevated porch that overlooked the front yard and the road. So we weren't too worried about anyone or anything actually being outside, since anything out there would have triggered the lights. We had heard lots of stories and watched lots of YouTube videos about the whole killer clown thing. And to be honest, I didn't think it was real. I thought it was just prank videos. Something made up just to get clickbait views. Plus, we live in a small town in northeast Tennessee where everyone and their dog owned some sort of firearm that included my uncle, a retired veteran. So we were never afraid of anyone dressing up as a clown trying to jump out for a quick scare and a funny video reaction, because if they did, they would meet the barrel of the gun very fast. So we were sitting on the couch watching the TV show. The only light being the TV and the dim light above the kitchen sink that was only a few feet behind the couch. Suddenly the back motion detector light came on. We did notice but didn't think anything of it. The lights were set on 10-minute timers. If it detected one movement, it would stay on and would turn off after 10 minutes if no other movement was detected. After 10 minutes, they went back off, so we figured it was just an animal, which wasn't uncommon. After about 20 minutes, I went to the bathroom down the hall. I did my business and washed my hands. When I left the bathroom outside, the motion light on the side of the house, by the side door that entered into the laundry room, turned on and shone through the thin blinds that were on the door. I swore I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel outside. Then the doorknob started rattling quickly like someone was trying to open it. I ran into the living room and got back to my spot on the couch. Luckily, the blinds were shut, so whatever it was didn't see me. I knew my cousin heard the same thing too, because he was already up and halfway into his dad's room to wake him up. At that point, I saw the light from the front porch come on, so I got up to look out the window that looked out to the porch and saw nothing. By this point, my uncle had his pistol and flashlight and was out on the front porch looking for who or whatever it was. My cousin and I were behind him on the porch watching. He looked around with the flashlight when he saw it. There, at the bottom of the hill, in the ditch by the road, was a clown. It was a crappy costume, one from probably Walmart or Spirit Halloween. It just looked at us and waved. My uncle fired a warning shot, and the clown ran across the road and into the woods. My cousin and I didn't sleep anymore that night. My uncle stayed out on the porch for a few more hours to make sure no one came back. I remembered him telling us not long after the shot was fired, he heard what sounded like an ATV starting up and driving away. Troublesome kids were always and still are an issue in this area. There are houses somewhat close to each other but far enough that you couldn't see them. The only house we could see was our grandparents' house. I don't doubt it was just a high school kid playing a prank, just trying to scare whoever it was in the house. Years later, after reading some more experiences with these clowns, of people's lives actually being threatened, it still scares me to think of what he would have tried to do if he was able to get in the house. For starters, my name is Alex and I'm in my mid-20s. Also, I'd like to apologise in advance for how overly sarcastic this post may seem. Humour is my way of coping with uncomfortable situations. For viewer warning, this post does contain murder context, but I don't go into much detail. If you're uncomfortable with murder, please skip to the next story. When I was a troubled teenager, I moved in with my mother and stepdad to escape a less than ideal situation. Because of the move, I was enrolled in a new school. This school was located in one of the sketchiest neighbourhoods in the city. Everyone who resided in that area was relatively low income, my family included. We had a rec centre near the school that was a hotspot for, let's call them undesirables, which was primarily teenage boys wandering over from the nearby high school to catcall the girls. Anyway, during my time at my shitty school, I made an array of friends. However, there was one person who became my best friend. Let's call her Brittany. She and I got along all right, but in an unhealthy way. I was a people pleaser and she took advantage of that. Brittany was nice enough, but she was problematic. Regardless, we were fast friends and thus began our very short-lived friendship. Over the school year, she mainly came over to my house since I was an only child. We usually had the house to ourselves while my folks were at work. However, she finally invited me to her house around the middle of the school year. I was super excited. I'd always wanted to meet her family since they were always such an enigma. Brittany wasn't one to divulge information about her home life. All I knew was that she lived with her mother, stepdad, and younger siblings. I'm unsure if she was embarrassed or didn't care to share, but I finally had the honor of meeting them. Honestly, her family was amazing. They were kind and treated me very well. After that, I started going to her house more and more, and you know what? I really enjoyed it. Fast forward to a month or two before the end of the school year, and it's Brittany's birthday. Her family was throwing a little get-together at their house, and I was invited. Brittany and I headed to her house after school, and it was a really fun time until near the end of the day. Now I knew next to nothing about her biological father. I knew he wasn't really in the picture. He'd sometimes drop by and say hello, but I had never personally met him. That was until he had made a surprise visit to give Brittany a present. When I tell you there was a shift in the atmosphere, I kid you not. I could immediately feel it, and I was a dumb kid. We were inside the living room eating some cake, and there was a knock at the front door. Brittany's mum answered, and her face, which once had a nice smile, turned into a scowl. If looks could kill, the dude would be dead. She moved aside, and this man walked in. I'll never forget how everyone in the room got tense except for Brittany, who excitedly greeted her dad. At the time, he seemed like a normalish dude, maybe a tad bit on the creepier side, but who am I to judge? Brittany introduced me to her dad, and we shared some pleasantries. At one point, I was invited to get some ice cream with them the following day, which I accepted. I mean, I was getting free ice cream. Of course, I was going to say yes. He eventually left, and we all got back to eating cake. I had honestly forgotten about the visceral reaction everyone had upon seeing him. Maybe if I remembered, I would have said no. Anyway, the following day rolled around, and I went for ice cream with Brittany and her dad. I can't remember much from that day, other than him asking me if I had a boyfriend or girlfriend, which seemed innocent enough, but the way he asked it made me feel weird. I honestly can't remember much from my other encounters with this man. Nothing really jumps out to me. I know I went out with him and Brittany a few more times before my family moved to another city, and we lost touch. Fast forward a few years later, and I'm attending college. I'd managed to stay in contact with one person from my middle school days. Let's call her Tiffany. She had reached out to me one day asking if I wanted to go to a movie, which I happily accepted. I was balls deep in a depressive episode at the time and needed a pick-me-up. A film with an old friend was just what I needed. I took the train to a nearby mall, and Tiffany and I watched the movie. Afterwards, we headed to the food court and got some food. We were catching up. It had been a couple of years since we last saw each other. When Tiffany suddenly perked up, she asked me if I heard about Brittany's father, to which I said we hadn't been in contact since I'd moved. Tiffany's face lit up, and she told me the most mind-blowing story my brain had ever heard. She informed me Brittany's father had murdered a woman. Now, before I continue, she was going based on word of mouth while she was telling me all the details. Tiffany had no news articles or police reports to back her story. She was told by a friend who heard from someone else, and so on. But what she told me wasn't actually far from the truth. According to her, Brittany's father had taken the life of a street hooker. He got away with it for 2 years, and his truck got him caught. Apparently, there was something unique about it. Tiffany couldn't tell me much more because she genuinely didn't know. I remember going back to my dorm and trying to Google for more details, but I couldn't find a damn thing about it. I eventually forgot about the story until last year, 2023. I was discussing the craziest stories from my life with a friend when I suddenly remembered Tiffany's story. After some digging, I finally found an article that described the crime. I clicked on it, and when I saw the picture of the man, well, Words can't describe what I felt. Everything Tiffany told me was true, but it was so much worse than what she and I thought. Out of respect for the victim and her family, I won't describe what he did. But he was arrested 3 years after he had taken her life. I can't find any information about how he was caught, but it had something to do with his truck. He was charged with manslaughter. He took a plea bargain and indignity to a body and only served 7 years of his 14-year sentence. He had served half already because he was in custody during the trial. I looked him up again not too long ago, and I learned some unsettling information which prompted me to write this post. He was released from prison a few months ago. Guess what he did? He killed another woman. From what I've read, it had similarities to the other murder he committed. This time around, he's charged with second-degree murder and indignity to a body. There's unfortunately still not a lot of information about the second woman, but both of his victims were mothers. They both were cruelly taken from this world, and I still can't wrap my mind around this all. I met this monster. I was best friends with his daughter. I don't think I was personally in any danger, but the fact I met someone capable of such heinous crimes, it scares the living shit out of me. I can't even begin to imagine how Brittany must have felt after learning of her father's crimes. Anyway, I apologise for the length of the story and how vague I was regarding the crimes. I know some of you really want to know everything, but it didn't feel right to share their story, especially since it had little to do with me. I was just the schmuck that was friends with the daughter. You never know what someone is truly capable of until it hits you hard. Thanks for listening to this wild story. This happened back when I was 22. A girl I dated since high school sporadically left me for another guy. On an impulse, I decided to travel cross-country to California to do some surfing. I didn't make any formal plans, and I'd say that it was fairly spur-of-the-moment decision. Not important, but it would demonstrate some of my lack of preparation. I slept in my car for the most part at Cracker Barrels if I could find one. I wasn't in a huge hurry to get to my destination. I was just happy to be out of the city and on the open road. I made detours here and there and also got rerouted a few times for one reason or another. I decided to save on some costs by spending the night at a campground one night. It was a comfortable enough setup, and I was planning on sleeping on the beach when I hit California, so I had my trunk full with some camping gear. My goal was to relax for the night and hit the road in the early morning. I set up camp and was beginning to settle down for the night. I cracked open a beer and lit a cigar. Suddenly, this girl approaches my slot and asks if she could join me. She was pretty, dirty blonde hair and busty. Honestly, everything you would potentially want in this kind of situation. I knew this wasn't going to end the way that my head was leaning towards, because she called out to the tree line and told some people that I said it was okay to join. 2 guys came out, both about my height, and something was a bit off about them. I rationalised this as just being a part of the circumstances. 3 strangers at a campsite with me, just not knowing who they were, seems as though it was reasonable to me to be a little uneasy. I had a Yeti full of beer which I shared. They played some music and we talked for a bit. They weren't horrible company, and from what I gathered, it seemed like they may have just wanted to split my beer and some of my food. As the sun went down, the topics of conversation as well as their behaviour got a little troubling for my taste. One of the guys just unzipped their pants and took a piss right near the fire where everyone was sitting. It didn't bother them, but I found it odd. Next, one of the guys just casually pulled out a belt knife and began sharpening it. He asked me some really specific questions, such as if my parents were funding my trip, and if I was carrying a gun. At my current age, I wouldn't have offered any information, and would have probably made an excuse to leave. But the younger me said no to both questions, which was a lie, because I carried, and still carry, a .357 Magnum under my seat. The other guy asked me how much pocket money I'd have to have on me to travel solo across the country. I told him that I was budget travelling and didn't carry cash on me. I got the impression more and more that these people didn't have pleasantries on the brain, and that I may be in a worse situation than I originally thought. Some part of me thought that I was just meeting some colourful travellers such as myself. Quickly realised that reality isn't quite as great. The girl, who was originally sweet and somewhat shy, became more aggressive as the night went on. Not like in a super intimidating or scary, but she became more vocal and more physical with the other two. Not the same girl that approached my camp. One of the bigger guys came over and had a seat near me, but dangerously close. I was leaning up against a log bench and he kept his arm around me, but not touching me. The guy with the knife asked me more questions, such as who knew I was travelling, when I was expected back home, and what I did for a living. The questions were too specific for me to rationalise as a casual conversation. I became extremely scared because it dawned on me that my dumbass did this on an impulse. I didn't have a job that would report me missing, and my family didn't know that I was travelling. I wanted my trip to be low-key, and in that stupid thought process, anything could happen to me and nobody would know. The guy holding the knife then started telling a story about his first time hunting. He asked me if I hunted, which I said yes. He then went into graphic detail about the first time that he and his friends went rabbit hunting, and essentially how they butchered a rabbit alive. The other two thought the story was funny. I didn't. I don't know if this was a scare tactic or the preamble to something more sinister. I didn't take my chances though. I got up to grab some more beers, one to contemplate how I was going to leave, and two to get myself repositioned away from the other guy. I knew I was dealing with something more serious when the guy that was sitting next to me followed me to my car, which was only a few feet away. I made several excuses to move, as I casually grabbed necessary items and put them in my open trunk. It looked like they were onto what I was trying to do, so I had to think fast. I noticed the one that kept close to me was slurring his speech from drinking, so I made my last-ditch effort using that to my advantage. I grabbed 4 beer bottles and passed them out, as I'd been doing. I took a small squirt bottle and dropped a few drops in my beer, and did the same to theirs. I raised my bottle to toast. Then the girl asked what I put in their drink. I told her it was just something to take the edge off and liven up the party some. One drank the beer with no problem, but the other two seemed hesitant. I insisted, but they didn't take the bait. I took a long chug myself and told them it was just THC, and it wasn't that potent. They eventually drank the beer once they saw that I was comfortable drinking it. After a couple of minutes I started acting sick, and realised out loud that I had mixed up the drops. One guy got angry and asked me what it was. I grabbed my head and told them I didn't know. Then I gave a very frantic apology by saying I'd been putting it in their drinks for the past hour or so. The bigger of the two started dry heaving and eventually fell over. The guy that was originally holding the knife started getting dizzy. The girl laid down while clutching the log bench, demonstrating what looked like seasickness to me. I threw up the deuces sign as I got in my car and drove off. A couple of things worth noting. 1. Because I still had a long trip ahead of me, I didn't want to be hungover, so we were all drinking non-alcoholic beer. 2. The drug administered was nothing more than liquid caffeine for a vape pen. Was I in danger? I'll never have closure to say yes or no. But considering the specifics of the questions, along with the sudden changes in their personality, I'm leaning towards yes. I considered just turning around and going home, but I pressed on to California. I also told everybody that I was travelling and which routes I was taking, and also checked in with family once a day because boy did I learn my lesson on making sure my loved ones knew where I am. That was just a psychology trick that I learned. I can't remember from where, but essentially I used psychology to save my life. Placebo effect, that's what I learned. Where you give people a pill that'll magically cure them, and they believe it and cured themselves. This time I used it to pretend to be ill, and to my pleasant surprise these idiots followed. Glad I lived though, and I am much more cautious now. I'm considering carrying heavier drugs in case I find myself in this type of situation again. Are tranquilizers hard to come by? Back when I was an 18-year-old female working in a fancy hotel, the maintenance man, a 25 male, was handsome, hard-working and funny. Over time we created a friendship and I found myself comfortable around his presence. A couple of months later he asked me out on a date. We ended up going out for dinner and then for some drinks. It wasn't a bad date at all. It was a nice restaurant and he was being sweet and kind to me. Until I asked him what his last name was, and he replied it was White. At first I didn't think much of it and we moved on. The next day at work I noticed that his name tag actually revealed his last name was Morrison. I never questioned this to him, but immediately found this to be very strange. When I got home I told my mum, who immediately saw it as a red flag. A few hours later she comes up to my room with panic, saying that the very man I went on a date with had beat someone to death when he was 17. The story was that he bullied and chased the younger victim to a dead end, where he acted out a prolonged and vicious attack that was so severe that the victim had to have a closed coffin. My mum is an avid investigator when it comes to these things. Needless to say that after learning this about him, we never went out again, but I did have to see him at work, which made it very awkward. He did come up to me several times, unfortunately, demanding why I suddenly gave him the cold shoulder. That's when I told him that I don't think we should go out anymore. Not surprisingly, he didn't like that at all. He got angry and constantly harassed me at work. Luckily, my manager took this seriously and fired him before it escalated too quickly. But yes, that was my creepy dating horror story. I sure hope I never have to see him again. After my manager fired him, my mum convinced me to quit my job and search for a new one just to be on the safe side, which I did. I'm now 25, and last I heard he moved to Mexico and joined a cartel. Yeah, I don't know how true that is, but I truthfully don't care. As long as he's out of my life, then I'm happy. Stay safe out there and take extra precaution when going out on dates with strangers. I wanted to start this off by saying this is a shocking experience I had, where the creepy guy I waited turned out to be a murderer. This is such a wild encounter that I still can't process to this day. It started when I was a teenager. I waited tables at a local restaurant to pay for the gas and insurance for my car. You know, the typical things teenagers used to do while going to school full-time. It was during my off-season that I was working. I'm a volleyball player and was saving up money to not only pay for car expenses but to go to college as well. Anyway, I met, let's call him Creep, sitting in the very back corner of the restaurant right next to the girls' bathroom. In my naive mind, he seemed normal at first, despite the fact that he was 20 and wanting to date a 17-year-old. Again, only a 3-year difference that didn't scream murderer to me just yet. Anyway, leaving my job after dark scared me, so I taught myself to get in my car, shut the door, and lock it in one fluid motion. It made me feel safe. One night, I was leaving work, and had just gotten into my car when Mr. Creep seemed to just appear out of nowhere, yanking my door handle to try and open it. I looked into his eyes in the split second before he smiled, and what I saw absolutely chilled me to the bones. I don't know how to describe the evil I saw. His eyes were like a black hole, emotionless and empty. His creepy smile just wanted me to jump out of my skin. He waved and laughed the most sinister laugh I've ever heard. I wasn't going to wait around for what he had to say, so I backed up and sped off. I think I may have ran over his foot because I looked at my rear-view mirror and he was holding it, like he was in pain. I don't know. I was just hoping that was the end of that. From then on, I was terrified of him, but I didn't show it because I was afraid of what he might do if I told him I never wanted to see him again. After this, he constantly showed up at the restaurant and lied to try to impress me, and tried to invent ways of being alone with me, but my instinct was to run, so I avoided him. About 2 weeks after this incident, the restaurant got robbed, and there was significant evidence against Mr. Creep, just not the kind that allowed the cops to charge him with. Mr. Creep took that as his opportunity to run away and escape. About 5 years ago, he messaged me on Facebook out of the blue. This infuriated me because he would have had to try really hard to find my Facebook. I had an unusual last name, so on my Facebook I changed it to the most generic last name possible, which was Smith. He went on about his top secret military clearance as well as a huge land and estate he owed, and that's why he had to flee. It made me nervous, and so I just didn't respond and blocked him. Until the following day, I was going about my business and scrolling through social media when I noticed an unsolved murder. And guess whose wanted face I saw for suspected murder? You guessed it. I saw his mugshot. He is now facing murder charges as well as 2 other violent felony charges. I am so glad to know he's locked up, but so overwhelmed about how correct my instincts about Mr. Creep were. I feel like I escaped a maniac. I'm beyond grateful I didn't fall prey to his games and didn't entertain him in the slightest. I was scrolling through TikTok one day when I came across a video of a girl named Anna. She was beautiful, with long brown hair and bright blue eyes. I was immediately smitten. I started following her and liking all of her videos. To my surprise, Anna followed me back. We started chatting and I found out that we had a lot in common. We both loved horror movies and pizza. We even had the same favourite band. After a few weeks of chatting, Anna asked me out on a date. I was thrilled. We decided to meet at a Starbucks near my house. I got there early and waited nervously for her to arrive. When she walked in, I was taken aback. She looked nothing like her pictures. She was much older, with wrinkles around her eyes and grey hair. She introduced herself as Anna, but I could tell that wasn't her real name. We sat down and started talking, but something felt off. She kept asking me personal questions like where I lived and what my parents did for a living. I started to feel uncomfortable. Suddenly my phone buzzed. It was a text from my friend. He had done some digging and found out that Anna wasn't who she said she was. She was actually a 40-year-old man who had been catfishing me. I was horrified. I didn't know what to do. I tried to get up and leave, but Anna grabbed my arm. She told me that she knew where I lived and that she would hurt me if I didn't stay. I was trapped and dumbfounded. I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get out of the situation. But then I remembered something my dad had taught me. He had always told me to carry a pocket knife with me wherever I went. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out the knife. I held it up to Anna and told her to let me go. She hesitated for a moment, but then she released me. I ran out of Starbucks and never looked back. I was lucky to have escaped that situation unharmed. But I learned a valuable lesson. You can't always trust people you meet online.